a cerimonialista CCH, pela gentileza, pelo apoio aqui no evento. Estou sozinho, eu e 2 lírios da paz, mas presencialmente aqui na mesa. A nossa mesa será uma mesa híbrida, com a participação, a nossa ideia inicial era termos também condições por questões de financiamento. Isso foi impossível, mas isso não nos impediu de fazer um evento em formato internacionalizado, Este evento vai ter, então, as 3 mesas redondas, e essa mesa redonda, assim como as demais, se eu não me engano, serão mesas bilíngues. Tá? Teremos uma fala da professora Emilse E em espanhol, e falas do professor Luís Bernardino em inglês e do professor Peter Vale em inglês. Depois, na sequência, podemos fazer as nossas perguntas, nossos comentários. Vocês estão convidadas a fazer todos os questionamentos que lhes vierem à mente, e nós, se necessário, faremos a tradução aqui para o contato com os professores. É isso mesmo que a gente tem interesse. Infelizmente, nem todo está a fazer com os nossos recursos essa inclusão e inserção de todos os pesquisadores, inclusive com seu idioma original, quando possível. Então, só vou consultar os colegas aqui da comissão. Estão todos na sala? Tá. Apenas para nós aqui, para fazer a menção, esta mesa é a primeira mesa redonda, portanto, do nosso programa. Ela vai tratar de crise e segurança contemporânea em perspectiva global. São pesquisadores e pesquisadoras que têm uma perspectiva com foco nos desafios do sul global e como podemos pensar esses temas que foram tradicionalmente temas de interesse do norte global e que o sul devidamente autorizado a discutir essas temáticas sobre defesa, segurança internacional, crises e assim por diante. A professora Emilse E é professora da Universidade Nacional de Rosário, Argentina, do Departamento de Relações Internacionais e da Faculdade de Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais. Ela tem doutorado na Faculdade de Ciência Política e Relações Internacionais da Universidade de Rosário e tem pesquisas focadas na relação entre política externa e política de defesa argentina. Então, a conexão da política externa e política de defesa argentina e também da América Latina, inclusive analisando alguns casos do sul global, dos BRICS e assim por diante. Atualmente, ela é também docente na Universidade de Defesa da Argentina, e que os professores e as professoras da Universidade Nacional de Rosário têm uma atuação muito importante nessa universidade. O professor Luís Bernardino é coronel do Exército, professor do Instituto Universitário Militar de Lisboa, possui doutorado em História dos Fatos Sociais e especialização em Relações Internacionais pelo Instituto Superior de Ciências Sociais e Políticas. É mestre em Estratégia pelo Instituto Superior de Ciências Sociais e Políticas também, e com graduação em Estudos da Paz e da Guerra no curso de Estado-Maior, e também integrado à Universidade Autônoma de Lisboa. Ele é um pesquisador, professor, doutor, pesquisador, e também com a sua profissão de ofício militar, uma vasta experiência na atuação da cooperação de Portugal com países africanos, sobretudo. É um professor de conhecimento muito relevante e que tem relações muito próximas, inicialmente com a professora Camila Rise, que aqui está hoje, agradeço muito a presença, e que felizmente nos últimos anos também tem o professor Bernardino se integrado juntamente com a professora Rise aqui ao nosso PPG. O professor Peter Vale, acho que alguns de vocês conhecem, né? Ele passou alguns meses aqui no Brasil e é atualmente ainda professor visitante do nosso programa, né, com atuação em diversas áreas da segurança internacional, um dos mais renomados professores de segurança internacional na África do Sul, pesquisador sênior do Center for Advanced of Scholarship da Universidade de Pretória, na África do Sul, professor emérito de política da Universidade Rhodes University, também professor honorário da African Earth Observatory Network. Esse é novo, esse eu não tinha sabido ainda. Cada mês o professor Peter tem uma nova condecoração. E também ele tem bacharelado em Relações Internacionais pela Universidade de Witwatersrand, em Joanesburgo. Completou o seu mestrado, daí o professor Tomás poderia me ajudar, na Universidade de Leicester. Leicester. Exatamente, nunca sei como pronunciar, no Reino Unido. É um professor com uma referência, uma vasta formação, publicações, livros, cada vez mais também tem ido para um caminho de análises de representações das relações internacionais, adiantando um movimento que na área de relações internacionais a gente tem chamado de virada estética, né, nas relações internacionais. Então, acho que também para os alunos que estudam teoria de relações internacionais também é uma excelente oportunidade de ver visões de pesquisadores não apenas aqui do Brasil. Então, vou começar a me comunicar com eles. Professor Peter Vale, thanks very much for the opportunity to hear you, to see you again. Thanks very much. Profesora Emilse E, muchas gracias por aceptar esta invitación para nuestra roda, para nuestra mesa redonda. Entonces, vamos a empezar todo el procedimiento con la charla de profesora Emilse E. So, Peter, we're going to start. I don't know, Luisa? Okay. E o Peter, ele vai iniciar ou não? Okay, so Professor Peter Vale will be the last invited to speech, okay? Y profesora Emilse E, si está bien, nosotros invitamos a vos a empezar en la primera charla. Muchas gracias por todo. Thank you very much for all the discussions here and for your keynotes in this seminar from the graduate program of international relations at the Federal University of Santa Maria. Thanks very much. Muchas gracias, profesora Emilse. Entonces voy a pasar el momento, el tiempo para su presentación. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Antes que nada, quiero agradecer a la Universidad Federal de Santa María por la invitación y muy especialmente al profesor Igor Castellano da Silva y a la profesora también Gladys Lequini. Y con respecto al tema planteado para esta mesa, me interesa poder situar el foco de atención en la importancia que tiene trabajar y debatir desde la universidad y específicamente desde las carreras de Relaciones Internacionales, el modo en que se desarrolla el escenario de seguridad internacional desde la mirada específica del sur global. Y este interés está delineado claramente por mi formación académica ligada a las relaciones internacionales, también por mi lugar de pertenencia profesional, que es la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y de Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Nacional de Rosario, y obviamente es producto de un análisis situado desde Argentina. Y en líneas generales, mi presentación se va a desarrollar en tres partes. Primero, intentaré desglosar una premisa general acerca del estado en que se encuentra el escenario de seguridad internacional para entender por qué es necesario abordarlo desde la universidad y con una mirada desde el sur global. Luego, quisiera puntualizar algunos procesos que considero son relevantes para la región específicamente de América Latina. Y finalmente me gustaría proponer una suerte de ejercicio de reflexión sobre esos procesos en el marco de la tendencia geopolítica mundial más relevante, que es la puja de poder entre Estados Unidos y China. Y cuando pienso en el devenir del escenario de seguridad internacional, entiendo que tanto la complejidad de la lógica de conflictividad que se hizo manifiesta con el fin de la Guerra Fría, como por otro lado la incertidumbre generada debido a la aceleración del proceso de transición en el orden durante la segunda década del siglo XXI, de esa conjunción resulta la configuración de un contexto de crisis en la gobernanza global con respecto justamente a la agenda de seguridad internacional. Y en este sentido, en primer lugar, y en lo relativo a esa primera variable que es la complejidad de la lógica de conflictividad, todos sabemos que se vuelve visible en la década de los 90, luego de lo que fue ese brevísimo interregno de optimismo que se desprendía del triunfo del liberalismo como ideología y que se venía expandiendo de forma acelerada de la mano del proceso de globalización. Y que también había sido alimentado por el modo en que se gestionó la Primera Guerra del Golfo, en la cual se había logrado traccionar una respuesta internacional, multilateral, enmarcada legalmente en el derecho internacional público y que había estado ampliamente legitimada por la comunidad de estados. Pero el caso es que después de esa experiencia de puesta en marcha exitosa del mecanismo de seguridad colectiva de Naciones Unidas, el sistema internacional no volvió a mostrarse capaz de gestionar eficazmente lo que empezó a manifestarse como un contexto de seguridad internacional complejo, en el que se entrelazan dos lógicas de conflictividad muy distintas. Una tradicional, en el sentido de interestatal, y que continuaba teniendo como objeto de seguridad y sujeto proveedor de esa seguridad a los estados, y otra lógica de conflictividad no tradicional, intraestatal, y con una proyección transnacional que amplía el objeto de seguridad, a la vez que también le daba mayor profundidad en el sentido de que se pasó a materializar en diferentes ámbitos de la vida de las sociedades y por tanto pasó a requerir de un abordaje que excedía la implementación monolítica del instrumento militar. Y es entonces que observamos, por ejemplo, la supervivencia de estallidos bélicos entre estados como una posibilidad real, en el caso, por ejemplo, de Etiopía y Eritrea, India y Pakistán, Perú y Ecuador, más cercano en el tiempo en los casos de conflicto entre Georgia y Rusia y actualmente entre Georgia y Ucrania. Y al mismo tiempo, en simultáneo, vivenciamos también, por ejemplo, escenarios como el latinoamericano, en donde prolifera el narcotráfico, el crimen transnacional organizado, u otros escenarios como el africano, en donde acontecen guerras interétnicas, algunas de ellas con un trasfondo religioso, y en cuyas costas, por ejemplo, también avanza como amenaza la piratería. O si nos trasladamos a otras latitudes y pensamos en las ex repúblicas soviéticas, observamos un amplio abanico de conflictos congelados, ligados a reclamos violentos que tienen raíces separatistas y que también se replican en otras partes del mundo. Y todo esto teniendo además como gran telón de fondo la articulación del fenómeno del terrorismo internacional con sus diferentes variantes. Ahora bien, si pasamos a la segunda variable de la premisa que les propuse, relativa a la incertidumbre que genera la aceleración del proceso de transición en el orden durante la segunda década del siglo XXI, claramente podemos observar que los acontecimientos de los últimos años han terminado por darle forma a el corrimiento que veníamos teniendo del eje de poder mundial de Occidente hacia Oriente. Y puntualmente estoy pensando en la disputa tecnocomercial entre Estados Unidos y China, la irrupción de la pandemia, y también en el desenlace bélico que tuvo el escenario de conflicto que venía transitando Ucrania desde finales del año 2013. todos estos eventos entiendo que han impulsado la definición de ese proceso de transición en el orden, impactando en lo que entiendo como la capa tectónica de las relaciones internacionales, que parecía estar más afianzada luego de la conclusión del enfrentamiento bipolar, y que recogía, además, los criterios de gobernanza global sobre los asuntos de paz y seguridad de post-Segunda Guerra Mundial. Y esto porque, aún pese a los cambios que ocurren en la configuración del esquema de poder mundial, con la emergencia de las nuevas y no tan nuevas potencias, los poderes tradicionales, particularmente Estados Unidos y los países miembros de la OTAN, seguían posicionándose en un lugar de superioridad en cuanto a sus recursos materiales, logísticos, humanos, tecnológicos, un lugar de superioridad que les permitía proyectar poder a una escala planetaria. Y si bien esa realidad continúa vigente, también es cierto que alguna de esas potencias nuevas, o no tan nuevas, especialmente por su peso estratégico, los países del RIC, Rusia, China e India, vienen desplegando desde hace ya varios años un comportamiento internacional cada vez más sólido desde lo político-diplomático, considerado esto de manera individual o a través, por ejemplo, de la Organización para la Cooperación de Shanghái, y además con mayores recursos de poder duro. Y este comportamiento internacional da cuenta de su vocación por obtener mayores niveles de autonomía para gestionar la seguridad internacional dentro de las regiones en las cuales se insertan geográficamente. Y acá podemos pensar en Rusia y su proyección en Asia Central, en el Ártico, en algunos estados de la ex Unión Soviética, por otro lado China en su mar meridional y en el Indo-Pacífico, e India, por supuesto, también en el Indo-Pacífico. Y en este contexto, entonces, podemos afirmar que un nuevo proceso a nivel internacional está comenzando, que alcanza a la dimensión estratégico-militar de las relaciones internacionales y que en el mediano y en el largo plazo va a implicar movimientos de alineamiento y realineamiento por parte de los estados, en términos generales, del sistema internacional, y entre ellos aquellos estados pertenecientes al sur global. Estados que además van a quedar sujetos a la inestabilidad propia de la disputa hegemónica de poder entre Estados Unidos y China. Finalmente, y como resultado entonces de la conjunción entre la complejidad de la lógica de conflictividad y la incertidumbre derivada de esa aceleración del proceso de transición en el orden, entiendo que estamos transitando por esa crisis de gobernanza global de la agenda de seguridad. Y no solo debido a las carencias de una respuesta meridianamente articulada por Naciones Unidas, que es la instancia formal, legal y legítima para gestionar esta agenda, sino también debido a la irrupción de potencias nuevas que bregan por hacer valer sus marcos conceptuales con respecto a lo que entienden por gobernanza y al modo en que consideran esa gobernanza debe ser materializada. Y se trata de marcos conceptuales que están muy enraizados al origen no occidental de estos estados, a su pertenencia al sur global, y que se plasma en un discurso político y diplomático que da cuenta de esa mirada particular que tienen sobre el mundo y sobre las relaciones internacionales, y que destaca ante todo la circunstancia de que existe hoy por hoy un orden plasmado en instituciones internacionales que no se ajusta a la conformación multipolar del sistema en el siglo XXI. Un sistema en el cual consideran que los usos y costumbres de los estados deben respetarse y ser tomados en cuenta, independientemente de que esos usos y costumbres se ajusten o no a los cánones de las potencias tradicionales. Y en este sentido, recordemos las consecuencias muy negativas que devinieron del empleo de la norma de responsabilidad de proteger en Libia durante el año 2011, con relación tanto a la pérdida de legitimidad de esa norma para buena parte del sur global, como para el resquebrajamiento al interior del Consejo de Seguridad, que provocó e impactó en las posibilidades de gestionar otros escenarios de conflictividad interna que ocurrieron a posteriori, como por ejemplo el acontecido en Siria. Y teniendo como telón de fondo, este contexto de seguridad internacional complejo, incierto y cuya gobernabilidad se encuentra en crisis, considero que como docentes, investigadores y académicos de estados que pertenecen al sur global, estamos de alguna forma llamados u obligados a debatir sobre el devenir de las lógicas de conflictividad que nos afectan, debatir sobre cómo nos hayamos posicionados frente al impacto de la transición en el orden y cuáles son los desafíos que tenemos por delante en el marco de esa crisis de gobernanza global. Por eso, y ya mirando un poco fronteras adentro de mi país, me he encontrado con un estado de situación bastante desalentador en el sentido de que los acercamientos a la seguridad internacional que se desarrollan específicamente en las carreras de grado de Relaciones Internacionales suelen excluir las dinámicas que preponderan en la región latinoamericana, que son absolutamente diferentes, como ya sabemos, a las que se entablan entre las grandes potencias o a las que acontecen en otras latitudes. Y en este sentido, repasando el contenido de cada una de las materias que en los planes de estudio nos remiten al abordaje de la seguridad internacional, muy difícilmente vamos a encontrar referencias a, por ejemplo, cuál es la propuesta para la defensa en el siglo XXI que tienen países de peso estratégico como Brasil, Chile, México, Colombia, o cuáles son sus percepciones sobre las amenazas o sobre el escenario estratégico global y regional, o por ejemplo, qué tipos de vínculos cooperativos establecen con otros estados en ese ámbito específico. Incluso las referencias a la propia defensa nacional argentina, si se las encuentra, son pero realmente muy mínimas. De ahí, entiendo yo, la necesidad de fomentar la mirada desde el sur sobre el discurrir que tiene ese escenario de seguridad internacional, y en este sentido, creo yo que si quisiéramos hacer un repaso por los procesos vigentes en nuestra región latinoamericana, que no podemos soslayar y que se articulan con las lógicas de conflictividad que nos afectan, se articulan también con el posicionamiento frente a la transición en el orden y los desafíos de la crisis global, creo que podríamos identificar 3 de esos procesos en curso. En primer lugar, observamos cómo se da ya desde hace un tiempo un aumento de la violencia y una complejización de los escenarios nacionales de seguridad pública, y también específicamente del escenario subregional en América del Sur, entendido como un todo, en un contexto en el cual ya desde hace varios años hay cierta debilidad de los mecanismos de diálogo político. Y con respecto a esto, los índices de violencia criminal denotan justamente la urgencia de esa agenda de seguridad doméstica, alimentada esencialmente por los circuitos ilegales del narcotráfico, del tráfico de armas, pero también se suman situaciones de protesta social con movilizaciones masivas de las sociedades que en ocasiones dan paso a expresiones violentas que abren la puerta a escaladas que tienen desenlaces muy inciertos, como pudimos ver a lo largo del 2019 y del 2021. Y en lo que se refiere específicamente a la subregión sudamericana, los escenarios que se desarrollan en Colombia y en Venezuela, además, digamos, de las dificultades que les son propias, también dan paso a derrames de violencia que configuran situaciones de extrema complejidad en las zonas de frontera. Una segunda tendencia o proceso en curso creo que es la continuidad del tipo de vinculación que tiene Estados Unidos con América Latina en general y desde la inmediata posguerra fría, en lo que respecta a los temas de seguridad internacional, y que en términos generales deja traslucir una autopercepción y comportamiento como una potencia hegemónica hemisférica, y también la vocación por liderar esta agenda de seguridad. En este sentido, el rol estratégico militar de Estados Unidos tiene una intensidad y una permanencia anclada en el despliegue territorial de sus capacidades estratégicas, de sus capacidades de inteligencia, de financiamiento, también de un esquema de influencias muy significativos en cuanto a las relaciones con las instituciones castrenses de la región. Asimismo, Estados Unidos es quien propone a los gobiernos las iniciativas y los planes de acción para afrontar las agendas de seguridad pública y quien sostiene los canales de asistencia financiera y de venta de armas, como sí también los programas de entrenamiento y de educación para las Fuerzas Armadas y también para las fuerzas de seguridad. Y ese despliegue ilustra su vocación de liderar los asuntos de seguridad, una vocación que es sostenida en el tiempo e inobjetable, independientemente de que sus intensidades y características vayan variando en alguna medida al compás también de los vientos políticos e ideológicos que soplan en América Latina. Finalmente, el tercer proceso en curso es la desatención de la defensa nacional como un área estratégica en la mayoría de los estados sudamericanos. Y esto se debe en buena medida a la reconfiguración del rol de las Fuerzas Armadas en posguerra fría, en torno al abordaje de esa agenda de seguridad pública, y en un contexto subregional caracterizado por un bajo nivel de conflictividad interestatal, el avance también de los mecanismos de diálogo político, la escasez de recursos, lógicamente, para invertir en defensa, y las demandas económicas y sociales cada vez más acuciantes. Asimismo, esta reconfiguración se concretó también en estados donde el retorno de la democracia se produjo de manera un tanto heterogénea, con instituciones militares que mayoritariamente preservaron cuotas de poder e influencia importantes sobre el sistema político, limitando en varios casos los procesos de construcción de la supremacía civil e imposibilitando el despliegue de una conducción política de la defensa como un ámbito estratégico dentro de los estados. De hecho, desde el año 2019, con mayor claridad, hemos empezado a ver cómo los gobiernos democráticos recurren a la institución militar para gestionar situaciones de alta conflictividad y que ponen en peligro la estabilidad de sus mandatos, y se propicia lo que se empezó a conocer como nuevo militarismo, lo cual aleja aún más a las Fuerzas Armadas de su misión principal, que es la defensa nacional. Así las cosas, y para ir cerrando mi presentación, les propongo un último ejercicio de reflexión sobre estos tres procesos en el marco de lo que les presenté como la tendencia geopolítica mundial más importante, de puja de poder entre Estados Unidos y China. Y como todos sabemos, esa puja se despliega preponderantemente en el ámbito político-diplomático y económico-comercial de las relaciones internacionales, pero creo que ha comenzado a mostrar algunos indicios de dirigirse, cuanto menos, a una coexistencia tensa de ambos poderes en la dimensión estratégico-militar de las relaciones internacionales, en lo relativo a la gobernanza de la agenda de seguridad internacional. Y cuando pienso en el impacto de esa puja de poder sobre Sudamérica específicamente, y en el ámbito de la seguridad, entiendo que no hay que proyectarlo en el corto plazo, porque el escenario central de la disputa desde una perspectiva de poder duro, estratégico-militar, hoy por hoy está preponderantemente situada en el Indo-Pacífico, donde hay un despliegue concreto, planificado y de larga data por parte de China, y que se direcciona a excluir a Estados Unidos. No obstante, creo también que es un tanto imprudente pensar que ese impacto solo en el largo término lo vamos a poder visualizar. Y esto porque el ritmo de los cambios a nivel del orden es acelerado y también en función del valor estratégico de la región latinoamericana por sus recursos y por su posicionamiento geográfico. Por eso, como primera cuestión, me parece importante no dar por supuesto el comportamiento de las potencias y estar atentos a los golpes de timón que puedan dar. Por otra parte, y de algún modo esa puja de poder entiendo que ya hizo pie en la subregión, ya se hizo presente, y si bien Estados Unidos no tiene de ninguna manera comprometida su hegemonía estratégico-militar a nivel hemisférico, durante lo que fue la administración Trump se notó un aumento de la presión sobre los diferentes países sudamericanos para lograr un distanciamiento con respecto a Beijing, al tiempo que pareció no proyectarse ningún tipo de incentivo o de compensación o de vinculación diferente a la tradicional. Y con Biden las perspectivas fueron similares, están siendo similares, aunque con modos menos agresivos, diría yo, pero lo cierto es que sigue estando ausente la elaboración de una propuesta política congruente con un rol más activo y casi que productivo de Estados Unidos como hegemón continental. Y este panorama de ninguna manera se asocia a una percepción de irrelevancia estratégica de América Latina, pero sí se puede vincular con la escasa gravitación que tiene a nivel internacional nuestra región y que de alguna manera permite comprender que Estados Unidos se limite a reproducir los esquemas de vinculación tradicionales. No obstante, esa escasa gravitación creo yo que puede volverse relativa en un punto en función del lugar que China le asigna a América Latina en general dentro de lo que es su estrategia internacional. Y en este sentido, recordemos que Beijing entiende a la región latinoamericana como parte del sur global, también que en 2019 se pronunció a través de su canciller a favor de la idea de que América Latina no era propiedad de ningún país, ni tampoco el patio trasero de ningún Estado, frente justamente a las declaraciones de Donald Trump acerca de su compromiso con el hemisferio para mantenerlo independiente de lo que denominó la intrusión de las potencias extranjeras expansionistas. Y en definitiva, no podemos perder de vista que Beijing lleva adelante una visión pragmática y no ideológica de las relaciones internacionales que le permite adaptarse con más facilidad que a Estados Unidos a los cambios de gobierno. Y con todos los gobiernos, de hecho, latinoamericanos, ha estrechado vínculos en los sectores comerciales, tecnológicos, financieros, económicos, y de esta forma ha aumentado exponencialmente su presencia. Y producto de esto, incrementa claramente su capacidad de influencia política. Y esto es justamente lo que le preocupa a Estados Unidos e instala una situación de competencia. En este contexto, entonces, creo que el desafío analítico, en algún punto más acuciante, es sopesar en qué medida los procesos en curso que les mencioné en Sudamérica pueden profundizar las vulnerabilidades de los estados frente a la proyección de poder que hagan las dos potencias en la subregión. Y acá entiendo que hay al menos dos escenarios vinculados a la seguridad internacional que demandan, por decirlo de alguna manera, nuestra atención. Uno se enlaza a los dos primeros procesos, relativos a la volatilidad de la seguridad pública y a la vocación de liderazgo de Estados Unidos. Y con respecto a esto puntualmente, hay que observar o seguir el pulso de las reacciones chinas en el caso de que sus intereses económicos y financieros se vean afectados no solo por un deterioro en los términos de la seguridad subregional, sino con respecto al comportamiento que Washington pueda tener frente a ese deterioro. Y el segundo y último escenario a considerar se vincula a la coalición de intereses en el Atlántico Sur, en torno a lo que es la navegación, la accesibilidad a las rutas comerciales, los recursosictícolas y energéticos, y por supuesto, con respecto al acceso a la Antártida. Y con relación a esto, hay que considerar, en primer término, la vocación explícita de China de tener una proyección naval global y de transformar su armada para defender, además de los mares cercanos, aquellos que le son lejanos, entendiendo que los intereses de ultramar son una parte crucial del interés nacional chino. Asimismo, también tenemos que tener en cuenta la percepción que va desarrollando Estados Unidos desde hace ya varios años con respecto a la vocación china y a las condiciones materiales que va adquiriendo para concretar esa vocación. Y con respecto a esto hay indicios de que la puja entre las potencias está empezando a impactar en América del Sur, teniendo como eje la defensa de los recursos marítimos frente a lo que Estados Unidos denomina un comportamiento predatorio de los pesqueros chinos. Y la pregunta acá también puede ser si en el mediano plazo esto no puede llegar a implicar una suerte de reemplazo por parte de Estados Unidos de la guerra contra las drogas como eje rector del vínculo con la región, en función de un paradigma que se encuentre más en contacto con la defensa hemisférica frente a la presencia de China. Por otra parte, y para cerrar con la presentación, si retomamos el tercer proceso subregional relativo a la desatención de la defensa nacional como un área estratégica en la mayoría de los estados sudamericanos, las perspectivas no son muy alentadoras en cuanto a la posibilidad que tienen los gobiernos de desplegar una política exterior y una política de defensa con respecto a estas cuestiones que le permita mantenerse lo más al margen posible de situaciones en las cuales esa puja de poder pueda llegar a escalar. Muy por el contrario, creo que los niveles de vulnerabilidad en términos generales son muy grandes. Bueno, como verán, quedan abiertos muchos interrogantes para que podamos reflexionar y pensar un poco. Y bueno, es todo por mi parte. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Muchas gracias, profesora Emilse, por su presentación. Entonces voy ahora a pasar la charla para professor Luís Bernardino, qual combinamos previamente até para auxiliar o processo, né, de diálogo com o professor Peter Vale. Falará, então, em língua... agora sim, estou na tela ali, professor Bernardino. Boa tarde, professor Bernardino. Já à noite aí em Portugal. Agradeço novamente a sua generosidade, o seu tempo e a disponibilidade para nos brindar com essas crises contemporâneas. Muito obrigado e passo a palavra para você.
Antes de começar em inglês, obviamente dirigir-me em português e agradecer o convite para estar nesta mesa redonda. É um prazer, de facto, poder partilhar convosco esta experiência e espero que, efetivamente, este debate possa ser muito profícuo e que, obviamente, possa ajudar e contribuir para que os alunos reflitam sobre a segurança global. Well, now I switch to English. I would like first to thank you for this kind invitation. It's, of course, my pleasure to be here today, this evening in Lisbon. I would like to salute Professor Igor Castellano da Silva and Professor Bruno Endler for this kind invitation. Of course, it's always a pleasure when we meet for discuss this kind of issues. I would like to salute our colleagues from today, Professor Emilse and Professor Peter Vale, and I would like also to salute the audience in Brazil and online all over the world. I will have a PowerPoint presentation, so I will try, if you allow me. I would like to share this presentation. Yes. Are you seeing the screen with the PowerPoint? Are you able to see the PowerPoint slides? Okay. So I will take about 20 minutes, and my speech will talk about international cooperation, and I would like to share some thoughts about what is the international cooperation and what shall we do between the responsibility of the state and the responsibility of the organizations to face all the challenge we have in our days in the international arena. This is some good references, and I will share the agenda, and I will take first an overview about the global impact of the regional conflicts, and second, I would like to talk about the role of the state in the international organizations, and then I will switch to explain and to try to explain what is the multilateral cooperation. And in the end, I will also try to give some conclusions. And then I will hope to have time for the discussion. Well, we live in a complex and increasingly interdependent world characterized by the interaction of multiple and multidimensional actors who, operating in a local or regional dimension, have a global impact. This is the present paradigm of the globalization, reflected in the complexity of the international political system and in the transformation of the societal problem to a global scale, associating cyber dimensions like the cybercrime, the cybersecurity, or the cyber conflicts. Nowadays, to understand security problems requires to adopt a more dynamic, integrated, and multidimensional analysis because globalization has made this approach more complex and much more difficult to understand, and of course, more problematic to get the right capability to respond. So in this reflection, I will propose an academic view about the need to question the international cooperation for the global security and criticize the role of the state and the organization and what is the solution for this problem. First part, I will now talk about the global impact of the regional conflicts. The phenomenon of globalization, as we know, has transformed contemporary security and given them a dimension that impacts geoeconomical, global markets, and global network and become far a global security problem. Globalization indeed is a multiplier of the effects of crises and conflicts, which have become responsibility not only for the states directly involved in the resolution, but for everyone, and specifically for the international organizations. It's a complex problem because complex problem requires integrated and more far-reach solutions. And this is only possible with organizations, but nevertheless, strategically engaging the member states. According to this new paradigm, the global impact of regional conflicts has contributed to a greater difficulty to understand nowadays the international political system and has also contributed to create some anarchy in the framework, what we can call the new international system. On the other hand, the new typology of wars and conflicts and the new framework of threats and risks has a significant impact on global security and global energy, particularly on the world supply of decarbonates, affecting sustainable development and sustainable security. This is the reality that we are already living today in this new conflict era, in line to what we can call hybrid warfare, and I'm quite sure that you are aware about this, and associated with the cyber terrorism, cyber conflicts, and very soon in the new dimension, in the new generation of conflicts associated with the ability to operate in space and in deep waters. We have a complex puzzle where the ability to influence the global order has become more frequent, and the answers to emerging security problems is now at other level of the geopolitical decision-making process. This aspect is especially recognized in the current war situation in Europe between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and more recently in the war between Israel and Hamas Palestine in the Gaza Strip. And we know that in these conflicts, we see that the war impact is not only local or regional, but globally, because it affects the geoeconomy, the world finances, and especially these are the disruption in the world energy market. That is why we need a more integrated and complementary solutions between power and states and the legitimacy that is associated to the multilateralism engagement on the conflicts. So what is the role of the states and international organizations? The main question today is, will the state have the relevance that we think in this international arena? Or is the state able to solve the complex security problems in their multiple dimensions? Or are the states the main responsible for this global security? This is the question that is not easy and doesn't have a direct answer, because we should not simplify, since interstate conflicts have become not only a national, but regional and even global responsibility. This paradigm is clearly visible in Africa, where the called African Peace and Security Architecture, created by the African Union in 2002, focused on state but they transfer to African regional organizations the capability and also the responsibility to jointly intervene and create a better conditions to solve these regional conflicts. In Africa, as you know, normally the conflicts goes behind borders, and the level of commitment and impact in the society is very, very high. Because borders become more dynamic and more volatile, and also because many of those conflicts are no longer limited in a map and in a continuous space, but is identified in a large space and in a long, long term. So what is the international cooperation doing? In this new, unstable and global, dangerous new type of conflicts and wars, international cooperation seems to be the best approach to solve conflicts that exceed the capacity of states. And we can see, for example, even the United States was, as a global power, not able to deal with the 11th September 2001. So international cooperation should be understood as a positive and deep relationship between all actors that have common objectives, combining strategies to control, to solve, or to mitigate the effects of a conflict and a war. International cooperation even appears as the best and maybe sometimes the only way to place dialogue and to focus on the preventive diplomacy as a key element for peaceful conflict resolution. Cooperation between countries, or what we call now bilateral cooperation, currently seems to be weak and inefficient, and is not always assumed as legitimate and normative way to solve these complex conflicts. It is usually does not have the legitimacy granted by able to invade in commas the territory or affairs of the others. When cooperation between certain states is often not understood as completely neutral or positive in the way that can resolve the conflicts, or even in a much more complex situation when it doesn't have all the full legitimacy and the right way to deal with the international law. On the other hand, multilateral cooperation is an assumption that together we are stronger and more legitimate, which also does not always stop or frozen the regional conflicts, as we know. However, multilateralism nowadays is the reference and is seen as the best way to intervene in a conflict or a war, especially when international cooperation with international organizations has the capability and legitimacy, which is not always the case, as we know. It seems today that neither states nor organizations show full capability to solve security problems and bring integrated solutions to the complex war as we are currently facing. What we want to demonstrate in this slide is that we need to look at the world in a different way and to invest in multiplying the potential and the power that come from the this new multilateral cooperation. So the question is, what is this multilateral cooperation? We can understood as a cooperation that strategically articulates an analysis from the perspective of the states and integrates the multilateral approach that can be complementary and lasting and much more complete. Because we are looking for integrated and articulated solutions to face complex and very deep complexity in the global problems today. So what is the contribution of this multilateral cooperation to the conflict resolution. In this new way of analyzing and addressing global security problems implies first a strategic engagement of states and organizations, strengthening the bilateral and multilateral dialogue, assuming that international cooperation is the essential tool to solve conflicts. We want a strategic cooperation that combines the potential with legitimacy, capacity with will, and, of course, resources with intentions. The bi-multilateral cooperation is the epistemology of critical thinking, a constructive action, and the ideology of reason in favor of strengthening cooperation between states and organizations and consolidating the role of the strategic international cooperation for conflict resolution. Bilateral protocols and initiatives cease to be purely the domain and responsibility of the states, but is a political and strategical integrate with the dynamics of the international organization, and in that way we can contribute for a better conflict resolution. So the bi-multilateral cooperation is a challenge and an opportunity for states and for organizations which need to become more relevant in the context of the international cooperation, but at the same time it is also an opportunity not only to gain preeminence in the context of the new international relations, but also to be able to assume that together we are stronger and we will be stronger and more efficient to face the main challenge that we have today. So what is the contributions of this bi-multilateralism to the global security? In a complex scenario like the current international reality, where states and organizations, as we have seen, are affected by scenarios of high geopolitical complexity, it is important for governments to solve their problems of insecurity by ensuring strategic international cooperation and good management of resources. And in fact, this is the dilemma of these modern times. Do more and better with much less, which necessarily implies a new strategic approach to international cooperation and the wise use of tools in support of the foreign policy in a full strategic cooperation. This innovative paradigm of looking international cooperation will need to constantly monitor what is happening at the multilateral level and in the regional dimension. So this cooperation intends to empower a strategic vision, to articulate a multilateral cooperation with the bilateral or state-to-state cooperation, longing for optimized solutions that must be articulated, must be complementary, and of course, consequential. It implies for countries to work with regional organizations and also a more dynamic participation in the multilateral domain, articulating at all times the bilateral cooperation made by the states with the multilateral cooperation done by the organizations. This understanding between multilateral engagement between organizations and the bilateral liaisons in cooperation between independent states is the core and is the center of gravity of the bi-multilateralism, and will be one of the main challenges for the leadership in the near future. So I'm coming to an end. As the conclusions, we are currently facing an extremely challenging dilemma, that of being able to solve the security and in developing dilemmas that challenge our societies. In this context, we look for a new paradigm where the solutions to the most complex dilemmas involving strengthening international cooperation between states and organizations and assuming more objective strategic understanding the capability to make the difference in the context of the current society challenge. And of course, particularly in the terms of the contribution for the global security. So the bimultilateral cooperation results from the greater strategic integration between states and organizations, not only in the identification of the problems, but mainly in the constructions of a more robust, legitimate, and far-reaching solutions to the conflicts. This growing complexity of regional conflicts and the problems in the future requires, of course, as we saw, a strategic, more robust, and far-reaching responses which are only possible through this cooperation that allows organizations and states. That is implying a greater commitment between states and organizations, since in order to face today's complex problems, we need to have in the future a more integrated solutions between states and organizations, because only a possible by multilateral approach for the cooperation and for the international cooperation on the security. So thank you very much, and we'll be at your disposal for the questions you might have in the questions and answers period. So thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor Luís Bernardino. We were having some issues with the sound here at the auditorium, but finally we could understand the whole presentation. So thanks very much for your presentation, your insights. And now I promptly pass the floor to Professor Peter Vale, who is already online. Professor Peter, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for this invitation. I feel deeply honored by your knocking at this door so that we can talk. Despite the painful topic of this and other seminars in this interesting series, I want to begin on a celebratory note by greeting all my friends, comrades, and colleagues at UFSM. I miss you and that joyful place. To my Brazilian family is what I call you. Thank you for your good wishes and your understanding over my illness a year ago. I'm happy to report that I'm much better, although I will never be completely cured. Thomas Paine, the American political philosopher, in 1776 wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls. These are the times that try men's souls." Adjusted for our own times, we might say this is an age that is trying all our souls, because suddenly and silently the world is at war. Not only the great wars of this age, Ukraine, the Middle East, but in the 30 minor or lesser wars which litter the international landscape. I want to talk today a little about ideas in international relations rather than talk, as my two colleagues have done, about what is happening on the ground. But I want to insert in that conversation the responsibility of scholars, because as bodies keep piling up, should we be talking about theoretical and abstract questions? I think we should. We scholars of international relations are charged to explain, and answer two questions in the age in which we live. What has happened and why? And then to answer Lenin's famous question, what is it that is to be done? What is to be done? And I think that is the consistent call that we scholars have, and that we should turn to our students and get them to think about it. But I want to say this too. We scholars of international relations are no longer alone in answering these questions. Social media and technology have given us the responsibility to answer these questions together with the end of the world. And if you don't think the world is at crisis, my friends, I think that we should take a leaf out of the book of the Indian philosopher and novelist and writer Arundhati Roy, when she says, there is war talk in the world. Every country, every state, and last night even in my beloved Netherlands, there was war talk. And when economic growth is increasingly measured as the result of the success of the weapons industry, where we should worry about the state of our world. So let me try and address a bag of issues that I've been carrying in my thoughts this year under three themes: the past, the present, and the future. If these are not so much themes, these are headings: the past, the present, and the future. Let's talk first about the past. All conversations on the past begin with the famous phrase from William Faulkner, the American writer, in 1951. The past is never dead. It's not even past. The past is never dead. It's not even past. But there are things that we can think about. One is that for all the sudden spurts of acceleration, social and political change is very slow. It's glacial. It's like the melting of the snow caps. And I think this is what the Ukraine war has taught us. That political change, however much we celebrated when the Cold War ended, doesn't really end all that fast. Secondly, because slogans sometimes drive our understandings, we must be aware of slogans. Think about slogans, identify slogans, speak about slogans. The best example of this is Francis Fukuyama's End of History thesis. Embedded in philosophical analysis, it was received by celebration. Although he looked deeply into the issues that represented philosophical approaches, when he spoke those words of the end of history, it was received with great cheering, particularly in the West and the United States. And this celebration blurred rather than revealed anything. Because we celebrated, we didn't think the thing through properly enough. And I believe that if we look back on it now, for all the success that we celebrated, and I celebrated too, the end of history covered up deep ideological strains in the world. The past teaches us to be cautious on those who are telling us to celebrate. And here, as my Brazilian family will know, my favorite cause is against think tankers. Because think tankers do not think. as Hannah Arendt, the German-American philosopher, said. Think tanks have grown into an industry with its own interests. Let me give you an example. When I started in this career 50 years ago, Chatham House, which now speaks as a major think tank across the world, was a mixture of a gentleman's drinking club and a place for conversations. You could never get into Chatham House unless you were invited and had a pass to get into Chatham House. But today, Chatham House relies on funding, on public funding, on funding that comes from states and funding that comes from business. And they can't wait to get you through the door in Chatham House and in other places like this. I started my career in the South African Institute of International Affairs, which is the South African equivalent of Chatham House. The other thing we must think about in the past is another thing that my Brazilian family understands very clearly, and that is that language matters. How we talk about these things matters. How we talk about peace, who talks about peace, who talks about peaceful change matters. As Roland Barthes, the French cultural and philosopher, put it, language is legislation. Speech is the code of language. We do not see the power which is in speech because we forget that all speech is classification, and all classifications are oppressive. So when we talk, we tend to push things to the side and not analyze it, and tend to talk within set patterns. And I think the world language that's emerged is not so much English, but a kind of business neoliberal English. And because the way we talk about international relations and the world and war and peace, the English is a kind of business neoliberal form of English. And we must be careful of how limited that is. Let me talk about the present. Rahm Emanuel, who was an advisor to, and indeed a head of his office to Barack Obama, once wrote, "Never let a serious crisis go to waste, because a crisis is an opportunity to do things you think you could never do before." So because there is a crisis at the moment, we are able to do things, we are able to think things that we would never think before. It is clear, I think, because we are not able to think about this before, that empires take a long time to die. Russia's nostalgia for its empire seems no different, actually, to Britain's nostalgia for its late empire. And as we think about this, as we think about how long it takes for empires to die, there are two empires we should perhaps think about. The one is, I think, tailor-made for Brazilian scholars, and maybe in raising it, I don't really know, I really prove that I don't know the literature. Maybe there's an opportunity here for us to begin to think about the death of the Portuguese Empire. Is it finished? And more importantly, much more importantly, this provides an opportunity for us to think about how long will it take for the American empire to die? If we want to change the world, if we want to lessen war, I think that's something we should begin to think about now and begin our students to think about things now. The third thing we must do at the present is try and answer the question of why do some things change quickly like business, changes quickly. Last week, as you know, there was this major bust up in ChatGPT, changed quickly in 24 hours. And why do some things change slowly? I don't think international relations understands that. And for that reason, we must draw anthropologists closer to our work. And anthropologists, it seems to me, are able to teach us things which IR and other social sciences can't teach us. If you want an example, look to my hero as an anthropologist. I have two heroes as anthropologists. One is my daughter, and the other is Gillian Tett, the British anthropologist who's now at Cambridge. Her work on Islam showed how Islam's flexibility allowed it to coexist with atheist and communist public order in Muslim countries. And she was able to show this because she was able to teach us something about the Muslim family rather than the Muslim state. And that the Muslim family relies on the household, not the state. Then Tet says something else which I think is an important lesson for IR. She advises people who want to understand the world to stay away from noisy social sciences. And if we think about noisy social scientists, there's not one that's more noisy than economics. And if we think about economics and the theme of the conference, the seminar, the roundtable we're busy with, we have to understand that economics is not driven by security or the necessity to drive and improve security. Economics is driven by fear of insecurity. It has an ideological face, economics. I don't think anthropology, modern anthropology, has an ideological face. The face of economics is mostly devoid of history and is mostly aimed at perpetuating a particular form of social organization. I often make the point that we in South Africa, before the end of apartheid came, our social relationships was mediated by race. Our social relationships today is mediated fundamentally by money. And this has created an enormous reinforcement of the problems of race. But we have no interaction with people of different people unless we talk about money. One of the other things we must do at this time, at the present time, is use social media as a tool for understanding society and social organization, rather than resorting to failed experiments. I think we must listen to what's happening in the Middle East. We must listen rather than coming with a set pattern of relationships, which clearly hasn't succeeded for as long as I've been alive. If we do so, can we imagine? Can we see? Can we hope to see a different Middle East and North Africa? I want to report to you on a little project I'm busy with a friend of mine. We run part of a journal which is called Actica Academica. And we run a conversation in that journal on social change, the importance of social thinking about social theory. He's a sociologist. I'm an international relations person. So we decided a month ago that we would run in the form of a blog regular interventions on the website and in the journal ourselves, and ask people to write little essays or blogs which answers this question: why is the world at war? You don't have to be a specialist. You can be. We'd like people to write about masculinity. We'd like people to write about religion. We'd like people to write about states. But mainly we want people to write about what they think is the problem in the world, why we are at war in the way that we are at war. Is it economics? Is it race? Is it just simply that the household is broken down, or that religion has lost its purchase? So let me send a challenge to my Brazilian friends and my family. Why don't you start a series on your site in Portuguese, or as our friend, our cousin from Argentina might also do this, a series in which you ask people to write 1,500 words on why the world is at war. That is partly democratization of the academic project, but it's also to teach those of us who are so-called experts that we should listen to people, and we should certainly listen to our students. So let me say a few things about the future. I'm always nervous of talking about the future because, as the great American baseballer famously said, I find it difficult to talk about the future. I find it difficult to talk about what's coming. I'm not going to get it right. I apologize. I'm too old for that, and it's too late at night. So I think we have to accept, and this is very difficult when we are surrounded by our books and surrounded by our knowledge. It's very difficult for us to accept that we live in a largely explored and unexplained world. We've only started the beginning of knowing, and we're not near the end of knowing. And if you want an example of this, we really know nothing about what's under the ocean, what's in the sea. Nothing. We don't know about insects in the world. There are species of insects we haven't thought about. How can we assume to know about the international, states in the international, people living in international, what the impact was of colonialism? So we need to be modest, and we need to ask ourselves, accept that we live in a largely unexplored world. For the future, we must accept the fact that binaries, war, peace, male, female, are not only a dead end, they're poor analysis. So the view that's coming out of the United States, or did come out of the United States until 6 weeks ago, that the world is divided between authoritarian and democratic states, is blinkered. It's not revealing. It doesn't tell us anything. It blinkers. It's a tool that we go back and use to help ourselves blinker the world. We must understand and analyze and imagine and reimagine the many manifestations of insecurity. We can go to insecurity by people who study poverty, people who study the impact of poor health, people who study and live with the poor. The power of security studies has blotted out the challenge for us to think about insecurity and the fact that we live in an insecure world. And finally, my friends, the thing that worries me the most is that the worship that the world is doing to artificial intelligence, AI. Will it be used to make war? Will it undermine peace? And will it create perhaps an algorithm to determine what is secure and what is insecure? Just today, this very day, a former boss of mine, who's now the rector, the seventh rector of the United Nations University in Tokyo, wrote a piece in a local South African newspaper about artificial intelligence and international relations. This man is a computer man and a computer engineer, but this is what he wrote. AI has been applied to predict and avoid interstate conflict, challenge climate change, spur on technology, facilitate trade, safeguard human rights, and underline and improve the international financial architecture. All I can say to that is, hallelujah. I think I've heard these words before. These words were included when the world was selling us the Cold War, when the world was selling us the end of history, when the world was selling up free market economics. A version of this appeared. But I think the selling of AI is of a different magnitude. And I would urge those people who are critical AI scholars and those people are simply who are interested in IR, international relations, and its future, to take this challenge from artificial intelligence seriously. I thank you very much for listening to me, and I send my warmest greetings from South Africa. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Professor Peter Vale, for his intervention, his brilliant insights. And we have, I believe, time for some debate and questions from the audience. I actually changed my position here for you to see the audience. We have we are in the period of the end of the semester, but in the beginning, I believe the auditorium was quite full, and now for the debates we have a more limited audience, but we also are transmitting the event to YouTube, and I believe your presentations were pretty much temporal, as we could say. Your presentations can be watched from 2 years, 3 years from now, and we can still debate some issues that you bring up to us. So thank you very much. I'll ask the audience if you want to have a question. So I'll just pass the microphone here to Professor Tomás Santos. Come here, please.
Thank you, gracias, obrigado. Que língua que eu falo, só para facilitar? São duas perguntas. Uma pergunta micro de ella, que es para la profesora Emilse. En razón de las elecciones argentinas, la victoria de Javier Milei, se ha hablado de algún cambio en la política externa o la política de defensa y seguridad de Argentina, algún cambio real, radical, o solamente un cambio retórico que es lo que yo creo que va a pasar en Argentina. Es una pregunta micro. Una pregunta que es macro, que es para los tres. Entonces, ¿se puedo hacerla en inglés, después en español? Taking especially one thing that Professor Peter Vale said about the language that we use to talk about things and to create the world we live in. When we take into consideration that public international law, which is my original field research and formation in general, can be understood as some sort of vocabulary that gives some sense of order and meaning to the world we live in. What changes do you three consider are being carried out in some basically in the law of war, in issues such as self-defense, when we take into consideration that the primary conflicts we have today, international conflicts, involve usually, with the great exception of Russia and Ukraine, a state actor and a non-state actor. And when we take into consideration that since at least, well, the whole of the 20th century, the basic structure of the laws of war that regulate international relations as a whole are designed to deal with state and state relations. But as mentioned, we still have that kind of conflict, but the primary conflicts we're seeing today involve state and non-state actors. And what changes do you see in the language that we use, the words that we use to talk about this? If you remember recently, Brazil's proposal for a resolution in the United Nations Security Council was accepted by the majority, but was vetoed by the United States, especially because they did not mention specifically and expressly the right of self-defense against non-state actors, or I think literally the United States wanted to the right of self-defense against terrorist groups and organizations. So what changes do you actually see happening? Because these are not just words to, let's say, quote Hamlet. This is the basic structure with which we deal in international relations. This is politics at its core. Profesor Emilse, no sé si quiere que haga una traducción de lo que hablé o si está bien. El vocabulario de la derecha internacional, ¿qué ha cambiado en los aspectos centrales en materia de seguridad colectiva, de legítima defensa? Bueno, era esto. Gracias, thank you, obrigado, namaste.
Many thanks, Professor Tomás. Any question else? No? Anybody else making questions? So I'll have my time now, as I'm the mediator here. So I'll also have one question each, and I believe we could take notes now, and the invitees could have the time to answer this first round of questions. Okay, so profesora Emilse, una cuestión es que hay muchos cambios en América del Sur y me parece que en tuya presentación demasiados de estos cambios están presentes y una de las cuestiones que se puse es las relaciones del establishment o de los militares y también del poder político de los países sudamericanos o quizá latinoamericanos con China. Y en nuestra parte, creo que las relaciones con China en el sector económico es muy más acepta, pero que lo que vimos en Brasil, creo que en el sector militar las relaciones con China son muy cuestionadas, son muy criticadas. Entonces creo que y me gustaría de comprender en el caso de Argentina también y cómo piensas en el caso de otros países sudamericanos, la real posibilidad de China estar como una alternativa en el sector militar, en el sector de seguridad, a las relaciones como que automáticas, como que casi que mecánicas con Estados Unidos y también Europa. Entonces, porque cuando hablamos con los militares brasileños, China parece ser como algo como no debes ni pensar o ni hablar sobre China porque no es una posibilidad real de cooperación. Entonces, me gustaría conocer tu posición y tus ideas sobre esto. Entonces, para profesor Bernardino, I'll speak in English as well. So, in terms of this very interesting type or model of multilateral framework or structure of cooperation, and I think this is really interesting for us to think about. But I wanted to know if you recognize that perhaps this multilateralism within this structure of multilateralism is not so formal developed as formal organizations as we did have in the UN system during Cold War and perhaps the first years after Cold War. And as Professor Thomas mentioned, the blockage and the veto status within the Security Council has provided a very short of space and action for the Security Council to formally give some response for our current conflict. So is that still a space for formal organization in for example, in South America? UNASUR or UNASUL is fragmented and in the a step of de-organization. In West Africa, we have very short of resources for Nigeria or even Senegal to give responses for coups and internal conflicts. In Southern Africa, we also have these same problems of regional powers to give responses to, and formally in SADC, for example, to conflict. So what's the type of multilateralism we can find nowadays in these mobilizations or commitments to overcome conflicts? And finally, Peter, thanks for your patience. Lastly, as we could see, the language thing is pretty much important, and I loved your mention on AI and the problems we can face in the future. I wanted to hear from you if you have thoughts on what kind of actor in international relations can have importance in this AI debate. For example, we have scientists. They are actually directors in the open AI, the enterprise, that were discussing and including one of the directors that tried to improve the pace of adoption of AI, was actually take off the direction of the development of resources within the open enterprise, but also the other director that criticized also apologize for criticizing the supervision and transparency of the AI development. So this is an example of scientists and actually leaders of enterprises struggling to decide what is the pace of adopt AI in an environment of no regulation. So no regulation. So what kinds of actors do you think need to integrate this debate and be very attentive for the development of the AI technologies? So those were my questions. Thank you very much again. I'll leave the floor for Professor Emilse, and después vamos a pasar nuevamente con una rueda de arguiciones. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Bueno, antes que nada, muchas gracias por las preguntas. Voy a tratar de responder a todas, empezando por la última con respecto a China. Claramente la posición estratégico-militar de Estados Unidos es muy consistente en la región desde una perspectiva histórica, pero también en un contexto actual en función de sus capacidades, recursos y también, por sobre todo, como subrayé en mi presentación, en función de los vínculos que se mantienen dentro del Ministerio de Defensa, particularmente, con las instituciones castrenses de todos los países latinoamericanos. En segundo lugar, también es cierto que la presencia de China en toda la región en términos generales y en América del Sur en términos específicos, tiene un anclaje exclusivamente económico, financiero, comercial, tecnológico también, pero indefectiblemente, como planteé en la presentación, esto acarrea en el corto y mediano plazo mayor influencia política. Y acá es donde me parece a mí que tenemos que empezar a cambiarnos los lentes de análisis al momento de sopesar los movimientos de estas potencias nuevas, en función justamente de lo que son sus marcos conceptuales y de las fuerzas profundas que las atraviesan y que implican diseños de política exterior con tiempos diferentes a lo que quizás estamos acostumbrados en Occidente. China se caracteriza por tener un planteo siempre a muy largo plazo, y si bien es cierto que la presencia en América Latina hoy tiene estas características, eso no quita que, no en el corto plazo, pero sí en el mediano y largo plazo, eso pueda verse modificado. Del relevamiento empírico que pude hacer, detecté algunos indicios que son muy, muy concretos, muy acotados y muy específicos a algunos países, pero como dijo el profesor Vale, las palabras importan, y las palabras que se plasman en el documento Política de China hacia América Latina y el Caribe del año 2016 dan cuenta de una mirada a futuro con respecto al ámbito estratégico-militar de las relaciones internacionales, porque por primera vez se destina un apartado específico vinculado a las cuestiones de paz, seguridad y justicia. Y por otro lado, la afirmación de que hay que mirar con atención los movimientos de un Estado como este en la región es en función también de ver cómo se ha comportado internacionalmente en otras regiones del mundo, particularmente en África, y también, y creo que de forma más relevante, en Asia Central, en los países de Asia Central, con los cuales en los últimos 6, 8 años ha realmente comenzado a incursionar en vínculos específicos del ámbito estratégico militar, siendo que hasta el momento se había presentado lo que muchos analistas catalogan como una suerte de división de tareas en esta región en particular con Rusia, en donde China, de alguna manera, se la vinculaba más con las cuestiones económicas comerciales, en función principalmente de su iniciativa OBOR, y Rusia por una cuestión histórica, de vocación de liderazgo regional, de cercanía cultural y de otras variables que hacen más a las fuerzas profundas, se la asociaba a un rol más vinculado a las cuestiones de seguridad internacional. En función de diferentes datos, como pueden ser la realización de ejercicios militares combinados, los vínculos que hay entre las industrias de defensa, los vínculos comerciales en lo relativo a la venta de sistemas de armas, algunos programas de ayuda, las presencias de empresas militares privadas chinas en estos países, me da a mí para pensar que quizás de a poco y a futuro se pueda estar cambiando la dinámica de inserción de China en esta región, pese a la presencia de Rusia. Esto no quiere decir que va a ocurrir lo mismo en América Latina, y mucho menos porque los contextos son claramente muy disímiles, no solo por la presencia norteamericana, sino también justamente por la historia que vincula a las Fuerzas Armadas latinoamericanas con Estados Unidos. Por eso es cierto esta cuestión de cierto resquemor por parte de las fuerzas a vincularse directamente con Beijing en estos temas. Pero bueno, tampoco se puede obviar que bajo determinados gobiernos muchos estados han firmado acuerdos en el área de defensa, independientemente del grado de concreción que puedan tener o de las consecuencias efectivas. Pero bueno, creo que son pequeños indicios que no hay que perder de vista, y en el marco de esta gran estrategia internacional que tiene China a escala planetaria, hay que tenerlos en cuenta. Con respecto a cómo se ha ido modificando el vocabulario de las derechas en el sistema internacional, me parece que el profesor Vale puede realizar aportes más sustantivos, pero como él bien dijo, las palabras realmente importan, y me parece que hay un impacto directo de ese cambio de vocabulario en lo que son los últimos documentos en los que se plasman las posibilidades de cooperar entre los estados a nivel internacional. Y creo que en el marco de la guerra en Ucrania, el año pasado hemos tenido varios de esos documentos con una impronta belicista bastante contundente, sea el documento que se dio en el marco de la Unión Europea o las estrategias de seguridad norteamericana, la misma estrategia de seguridad de Rusia. No hay un panorama alentador desde mi punto de vista en este sentido. Y pasando a la pregunta, como solemos decir en Argentina, la pregunta del millón con respecto a qué va a ser de nosotros después del 10 de diciembre, bajo el gobierno del presidente electo Javier Milei. Hacer precisiones realmente es casi imposible. Me parece que hay una variable que hay que tener en cuenta, independientemente del discurso que se tuvo durante la campaña, que como bien dijo el alumno, fue un discurso muy duro y que nos permitía avisorar un giro rotundo en lo que es la política exterior del gobierno del actual presidente Fernández, en cuanto a los vínculos cooperativos, donde enfatizar las relaciones o en qué región del mundo Argentina pone mayor empeño para vincularse o generar lazos cooperativos para proyectarse al mundo. Retóricamente se podía, en momentos de campaña, avisorar un cambio rotundo. En el vínculo entre la seguridad pública y la defensa nacional, que como ustedes sabrán, en Argentina se encuentra regida por un marco normativo que separa claramente las funciones que tienen las Fuerzas Armadas de las que despliegan las fuerzas policiales y las fuerzas intermedias de Gendarmería y Prefectura. Ahí también se podía esperar, si se quiere, alguna suerte de panorama complejo en el sentido de una dilución de esa separación entre los roles de las distintas fuerzas, a sabiendas de todas formas de que esto tiene que tener una aprobación del Poder Legislativo para realizar una modificación en cualquier sentido, porque hay toda una estructura normativa, entre ellos la Ley de Defensa Nacional, la Ley de Inteligencia, que prevén la separación de roles. No obstante, yo creo que luego de las elecciones primarias y teniendo como objetivo la instancia de balotaje que se atravesó el domingo pasado, este escenario se modificó en función del acoplamiento de buena parte del partido del PRO, de Juntos para el Cambio, en donde tenemos como dirigente principal al expresidente Mauricio Macri. A partir de esto vemos que el discurso se empezó a matizar un poco, y en estos momentos, ya siendo presidente electo Javier Milei, esa suerte de suavización del discurso también se empieza a notar más. Tenemos una futura canciller que plantea tener relaciones con todos los estados del mundo en términos que caracterizan como normales. No obstante, es sabido que se puede prever que se van a enfatizar ciertos vínculos por sobre otros, y con respecto a las cuestiones de seguridad y de defensa, también es de esperar que se intenten hacer algunos cambios mínimos que, si bien a lo mejor no tienen un impacto a nivel de la arquitectura normativa, son impactos que de extenderse en el tiempo pueden resultar complejos. Pero hacer cualquier tipo tener cualquier tipo de presunción en este sentido realmente es muy, muy complicado, justamente porque día a día los argentinos nos encontramos con un discurso que va virando, Así que yo creo que la alternativa es esperar al 10 de diciembre, efectivamente, y además en la agenda nacional lo prioritario es la economía. Entonces también siempre la relevancia que se le da a los temas de política exterior y a las cuestiones de defensa es más marginal. Así que no tenemos muchas más opciones que seguir esperando. No se te escucha, Igor, me parece. No te escuchamos.
Ahora sí.
Sí, ahora sí.
Perdón, muchas gracias, profesora Emilse. So, I pass the floor to Professor Luís Bernardino.
Okay, Igor, thank you very much for these questions. Well, starting for the first question, we have to say that now we are facing enormous challenge in the world. So the complexity of the conflicts, it's very, very complex, and this conflict doesn't seem to have a kind of rule or a kind of way to understand the conflicts. We used to say hybrid warfare, like a big word to explain almost everything and put everything inside what can we expect that is not understandable as a war. But in fact, if you look for the war in Ukraine, is not like the same that we have the war in Gaza Strip or in any kind of the war that you have in Africa. So it is complexity of the different conflicts without border, without any legislation, without any rules, using different tools that we are not used to see or to study, brings, of course, difficult to understand and to accept what is this new conflictology. And the question is, so in this new age, what is the language? What is the global language for conflicts? And I have to say that it's no longer the language of this legislation. It's the language of the power. It's the language of the influence. It's the language of the ability to provide diplomacy. And that's why I introduced today this bimultilateral concept. Because what we see now is that states are weak and organizations are weak. So it's not possible for states to solve the problems, and even it's not possible for organizations to solve the problems. For example, in Africa, we don't have any organization that is able to stop conflicts in the regional context. And the states are not also able. They don't have the capacity to do that. So we need to bring a new dimensions for the solutions. So as Professor Peter Vale asked, what needs to be done? And the question, what needs to be done, we have to have a new approach. We have to combine the power of the states with the legitimacy of the organizations. And this multilateral concept, and I'm going to the second question, is a new way to try find a solution for the complexity of the problems. Because if you don't look as the power of the states engaging inside the organizations, the weak side of the state is not able to deal with these problems. So United Nations, even the United Nations, they are not providing security. They are not providing decisions. The Security Council is completely broken. It's frozen for the decisions. And even if you take the decision is not implemented on the field. So you see this organization, they used to be references for us, used to be the decision made by the big countries and they were accepted, is not longer anymore. They don't have the power to impose certain rules. And that's why in this diplomacy, engaging states, power states, weak states, but states that can bring a new dimension to the solutions, because sometimes they speak the same language, because sometimes they are able to understand what's happening on the ground. So what is today the problem between Hamas and Israel? What is the problem inside the Palestine? I think nobody is able to understand that. Nobody is able to provide an answer. And that's why if we don't have a knowledge about these conflicts, we are not able anymore to bring solutions for the conflict. So this concept brings these two dimensions to the solution. They want to empower states inside organizations, and they want to empower organizations inside states. And you have to look this in a strategic way. You have to engage more the states, and you have to engage more the organizations. So, and just to maybe to underline what I see and try to provide a little answer to the question that Peter provided today, what needs to be done? We need to empower our states and we need to empower our organizations. And we need to look in the new dimension where combining these two powers, they maybe can solve some of the conflicts. I'm quite sure that is not the right answer for all the problems you might have in the world, and there will come more. But we have to think in each region. We have to understand what's happening inside Africa, what's happening inside Ukraine, what's happening inside the dimension that conflicts that we are facing now in Palestine. And you have to look for this as a whole solution, engaging states and engaging organizations. I think this is not the solution, but maybe it's a new thing that needs to be discussed and need to be create a new place for the organizations and also a new place for states in international relations. And thank you very, very much, Igor.
Thanks, Professor Bernardino. So, Professor Peter Vale, the floor is yours.
I want to start by saying can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, your mic was off. Now it's already on. Thank you.
Okay. So let me take both these questions and raise some issues around them and perhaps bleed out to a few other things. When I was in Santa Maria, I began to think a lot about international law. And when I came back, I did a course in it once 100 years ago at university. And when I came back, I took the opportunity of rereading again Philip Sand's book, East-West Street. And if you want to read a book about international relations and its emancipatory and its trapping problems, and the legal side of it and the rise of human rights and genocide studies, that's the book for you. But then he wrote a book later, which is about the last colony, about decolonization and international relations, and which is an extraordinary book because it raises some of the issues that my friend Luís raises about small powers, about cooperation with instances, about using law as a tool, colonial law as a tool to fundamentally alter situations which are embedded in law. So that's that. I want to deal with two more things in international law. One is this question of language. I've actually found out that as I've thought about people talking particularly around the Middle East question, the international law of war, international law, sovereignty, all of these kind of questions, I found the language is a bit slippery, People move between ordinary, what is international law, what is the war of law, what is the war of prisoners, what is prisoners' rights, all of these kind of things. So I would like to see someone do a book, a small little primer called What is International Law? That international relations people can read and try and understand this better. So if I have a comment on the language, I'll say that it slips, is very slippery. The last point I want to make in international law is this. We have to remember that in international law, the biggest rogue state is the United States. It doesn't participate in the International Criminal Court. It is very, very tardy. When it talks about international law, it seems to be talking about liberal international order. And it's a kind of understanding of law that law is made by the rich, for the rich, and that's the way the world works. So if you're going to talk about international law, your conversation should start about the United States. Let me leave that there. Igor, I think there are two questions around AI. two fronts that we have to attack it on. The one is this important front that we should see international law, artificial intelligence, as something like the nuclear bomb, and find an international agreement that can control it. Something like the NPT or the international treaties of the 70s into the 80s, in the late 60s. So I think that's the thing we have to do eventually. But before then, we have to really stop the ideological broadcasting of the idea that artificial intelligence can save mankind, can equalize the world, can emancipate people, and can do everything. So the kind of thing that my former boss is arguing today in the newspaper, I think that has to be taken on. And it can only be taken on by people in international relations. So let me go back to something I said in my talk and really lay down that challenge again for Igor, whether you'll take up the challenge, you and the colleagues at Santa Maria will take up the challenge of asking your students and your comrades across Latin America and even in the United States to begin to write on why the world is at war. I lay that down as a gift for you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter Vale. Any questions? No? Okay, I'll translate a student's question here. So our student here, Vinicius, asked a question to Professor Bernardino. If your concept of bi-multilateral cooperation, it could be analogous or similar to the idea of strategic partnership, or if you could analyze that it goes further into a broader cooperation, or if it's similar to strategic partnership.
Well, Vinicius, may I?
Sorry, Professor Luis. Just let me find out if there is any other question here from the audience. I'm really sorry to interrupt you. So just a quick time here. So we have, no, I pressed the students and now we have two more questions. But I promise that those will be the last ones. So Luisa, Muri? So I'll translate again. No problem. Very good. Muriel, who is a student from the master's degree, she asked a question to Professor Peter, which is pretty complex, but I'll try to translate here. Is a question regarding your idea, Professor Peter, to ask people and in general ways to understand why we are at war. But actually, language is so this effort is a pretty much a democratizing effort, as I can see, and Muriel is interested in analyzing these topics of discourse, language, and the politics of silence. So what do you think about people that whose voices cannot be heard regarding international insecurities, and how can we hear those voices and understand the social and the diversity of views of international insecurities that should be promoted and included into the international security debate? And the other thing is that Muriel brought us a possibility, and she wanted to understand your understanding of that, your opinion of that. That is the theories of intersectional inputs to security. Theories that understand race, gender, and class struggles as many important spheres of struggling into ideas of security, ideas of securitization, and security priorities. What do you think about those, we could say, new theories, but actually they are not so new, but we are at least currently starting to hear them and to give them space to be heard. So we have the final question, the last one from Luisa. No.
So I was just curious to hear what is Professor Veo's take on why is the world at war? Just that is it. And yeah.
So just to conclude, we have two questions to Professor Peter Vale, one question to Professor Luís Bernardino, and I'll just complement that with a question para Professor Emilse, para la última rodada de cuestiones. Entonces, mi cuestión está conectada a la idea de cooperación regional, porque hay la posibilidad de las relaciones hemisféricas, como son históricas, serán más o menos fuertes en relación con Estados Unidos. Pero, y la cooperación entre los estados sudamericanos, ¿cómo ves esta situación de UNASUR, por ejemplo? ¿Y cuál es el impacto de los cambios de los partidos y los cambios ideológicos de los partidos que gobiernan los países sudamericanos? ¿Qué te parece este movimiento de poca institucionalidad y también de casi que un encerramiento de UNASUR? ¿Y por qué crees cuáles son las causas, las razones más importantes, quizás las razones de cambios de gobiernos? No sé qué piensas. Entonces voy a pasar a todos en la misma orden. Entonces, empezando, profesor Emilse, por favor. Muchas gracias.
So who's first?
Sí.
Sorry, Peter. I'll just so I'll pass to you for the last round of answers, and Professor Emilse will start again. So the last round, Professor Emilse, Professor Luis, and finally Professor Peter Vale.
Bueno, con respecto a la experiencia de cooperación de la UNASUR, yo creo que fue una experiencia absolutamente productiva e interesante, particularmente en lo que respecta a la seguridad internacional, en función de lo que fue el Consejo de Defensa Sudamericano. Si bien es una experiencia que se desarrolló de forma muy acotada en el tiempo y que estuvo contextualizada en un periodo muy particular, en donde Estados Unidos, como potencia hegemónica, justamente tenía la mirada puesta en otras latitudes y en otros temas, en función del desarrollo que venía teniendo la guerra contra el terrorismo, la complejidad de escenarios como el de Afganistán, Irak e incluso Pakistán. La experiencia del Consejo de Defensa entiendo que fue muy productiva porque se dio en un ámbito que es extremadamente sensible, como son los temas de defensa nacional, y permitió generar un espacio de diálogo político en función de la realidad de que existe una dinámica de vinculación específica que enlaza a todos los países sudamericanos. Ahora bien, también es cierto que su corta duración se debe a esta cuestión de reconocer el sentido de la oportunidad, el momento en el cual llevar adelante un proyecto como este, y después con el cambio de aire y de los gobiernos terminó por desaparecer. También una experiencia muy atada a ciertos personalismos, y bueno, yo creo que si bien fue, digamos, un antecedente acotado y con un desarrollo un tanto precario en cuanto incluso a la institucionalidad misma, es un antecedente valioso porque, a ver, fue un primer paso en un área extremadamente sensible entre países que, si bien comparten una misma dinámica de seguridad internacional, tienen una historia también que en algunos puntos siempre ha manifestado complejidad en función de las diferentes miradas sobre la inserción internacional más conveniente para cada uno de ellos. Hay que ver a futuro si eso se puede retomar. Yo entiendo que en este marco de una puja de poder entre Estados Unidos y China no va a ser posible, porque más allá de eso, vemos cómo en el mundo se están rearmando o reafirmando esta cuestión de las zonas de influencia en torno a los diferentes grandes poderes que reclaman esos márgenes de autonomía para gestionar las agendas de seguridad internacional de las regiones a las que pertenecen. Y nosotros, geográficamente, nos guste o no, somos el patio trasero norteamericano, y por eso esta cuestión de hasta dónde puede expandirse China es relativa en el corto y en el mediano plazo. Pero creo que hay muchas menos chances que lo hubo en la primera década del siglo XXI de reeditar una experiencia como la de UNASUR o como la del Consejo Sudamericano. De hecho, con algunos cambios de gobierno que se han producido en los últimos años, como la asunción de Lula, este año de coincidencia con el gobierno de Alberto Fernández, o sea, no se pudo volver a generar un espacio de diálogo político en los temas de defensa de la envergadura que tuvo el Consejo de Defensa Sudamericano, y creo que también que de acá en adelante la agenda económica y social definitivamente impone demandas que son de carácter urgente para todos los países, y en este sentido hablar de defensa queda en un segundo plano definitivamente.
Perfecto, muchas gracias, profesora Emilse, Professor Luís?
Vinicius, thank you very much for your question. The multilateral approach is not only a strategic partnership, it's much more. It's a political strategic engagement. You need to change the mentality. You need to change the legislation. You might need to change the way that you see international relations. In school, for example, they teach you bilateral cooperation and multilateral cooperation. They split these two worlds. They never combine together. Even if you go to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, they have a department for the cooperation, bilateral cooperation, and that's another department for the multilateral cooperation. That's no longer that way. We need to combine this approach, and we need to be able to see what can we work and what can we do together. Because if you want to see and you want to be able to understand what's happened on the field, sometimes you need to be more engaged as a country, as a partner, but also you have to be more strong if you are inside the organization. So it's like a common view, it's like a common understanding for bringing a better solution for the problems. Because sometimes countries are not able to provide solutions, another time international organizations are no longer able to solve problems. So you need to empower both. And the empower of both solutions, it's combining both solutions. It's a question of mentality. It's a question of engagement of the states. It's a question of the states looking inside organizations, and they have more power inside organizations. And at the same time, when you think together that you need to bring the international organizations and use it as a tool to solve the problems. And this, in the affairs of wars and conflicts, it's important, because, and I finish with that, if you don't understand what's happened on the field bilaterally, you'll never be able to engage in the multilateral approach like regional conflicts or regional solutions. And you have sometimes to bet and to combine both dimensions and try to get a better solutions for the problems. And as I said, we have a big problems, and we have to find bigger solutions and more strategic solutions for these problems. But there's always a question of mentality. We need to change this separation, and we need to combine both approach. And I see maybe as a solution for a near future to understand the conflicts and try to solve the conflicts. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Professor Luís. Professor Peter, Leslie, but not least.
Let me try and answer the two sets of questions by starting with what Luís has just talked about. Because I think the intersectionality issues is linked to the point he is making, that we are prisoners of paradigms. So when we see the paradigm of multilateral versus the paradigm of bilateral, we are caught not only in the words we use to describe it, but the organizational structures set up in a ministry, which has deputy ministers for each of these, and ministers and parliamentary committees and all of that. So we often have to begin the conversation with finding ways in which we can talk about the paradigms we use, and find that as a way of trying to break down particular interest groups. I mean, amongst the most dangerous people at the universities, I once had a list of most dangerous people at the universities. One of my most dangerous groups was the dean, because the dean doesn't want to let anything in his parish go, in his company go. He doesn't want to let that go. So the dean sits and broods over how to protect the parish, how to protect the church, how to protect his people. So he never wants to find another way of talking to outside because it creates these problems. So I think we've got to talk to students about not only interdisciplinary, but multidisciplinary, and dare I say it, non-disciplinary issues. So we've got to change the language and change the paradigms. I think Muriel's other point about voices not heard, I came open maybe a little bit of a suggestion in the way that I talked so lovingly about anthropologists. Because I think anthropologists do open ways that we can understand, and more than that, are taught to listen to people with no power. And then I think another movement that's going on, which I think is extremely important, is that we allow people with no power into places where their voices can be heard. And one of the great tragedies of the year, I think, was the inability of the Australians to vote a referendum in which original people, or Australian original people, will be given a voice inside the making of politics and policies towards them. So this decolonization debate, which is going on across the world, which we haven't mentioned until now, is really important for us to get onto that decolonization debate and think about it. My dear Louisa, why is the world at war? I'll start with a story that happened in an elevator. A very good Norwegian friend of mine who has an interest in South Africa used to visit the country quite a lot, and he got into an elevator one day and he announced to the South Africans around him that he had found a solution to the country's problems. And one of the country's problems, which is the deepest, is a problem of white wealth and black poverty. And black poverty besieges white wealth. So if there's a lot of crime in this country, it's of poor black people trying to seize back what has happened. So let me remind you, the man is in the elevator and he's Norwegian and he talks with this funny Norwegian accent. So he says to the South Africans in the elevator, I have a solution for the country's problems. They're all white people. So they say, what is your solution? He says, go back to your houses and break down the walls around your houses that you've built for security. Break down those walls and take the bricks that you've used to build the walls to the places where black people live and build houses for them. So I tell you that story because it seems to me that the world is at war because we have continued a long march of impoverishing black people. It started with slavery. It continues with the impoverishment of black people. It feeds off neoliberalism. It feeds off particular discourses of economics. It feeds off racist approaches. So I think the deepest war in this world is the war against black people. And I think if you look at any of the wars that we've been talking about, even the war against Ukraine, in a certain way, we could argue about this, but all the other wars that we've been talking about, and I take Louis's point about classification of wars, but I'd not take it to, I think there's a conversation here to have about classification of war. There's a war against people of color that continues right across the world. Thank you. Listen, can I say, this has been a great pleasure to be with my colleagues. I've enjoyed meeting you and listening to you. I've heard much about our colleague from Argentina's reputation. I hope I can get someday to read some of her work. And it's been really nice to meet Professor Bernardino. And thank you for organizing this. I appreciate it.
Many thanks, Peter. Your lovely ending and insightful for everybody. So with these final contributions, I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, Professor Emilse Calderon. Thank you, Professor Luís Bernardino. Thank you, Professor Peter Vale, for this brilliant conference, this roundtable that produced many, many ideas and eager to mobilization here in the students and our colleagues and researchers. Thank you very much. This was the first roundtable in our annual seminar, and I believe the other roundtables we need to run to have this quality that you brought to us. Thank you very much for us. It was an honor to have you here remotely in this first time, but probably or perhaps in next time we can welcome you in Santa Maria. Even Peter, that has been here for a while and became a Santa Marian citizen. And so thank you very much. I hope to see you again soon. And I believe you plant a seed of creativity and eager to change in our students and our colleagues, as you put in mind. Thank you very much again, and see you soon.
Gracias, un gusto.
Obrigado. Thank you very much.